Hi, welcome to the vodcast on adding integers. It's a real quick review. Let's take a look at what the integers are here. Remember, they're the whole numbers and their opposites. The whole numbers are, of course, 0, 1, 2, 3, and on up, 4, 5, 6, 7, etc. Infinitely far in the positive direction. And their opposites, they go, of course, in the negative direction. 0 is its own opposite, and the opposite of 1 is negative 1. The opposite of 2 is negative 2. The opposite of 3 negative 3, etc. So no decimals, no fractions, just 0, 1, 2, 3, etc., etc., negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, etc., etc., etc. Remember, those three dots mean it goes on forever, following that same pattern in both directions. Over here I got some basic rules written down. These are the real easy ideas in adding integers. And I think probably it's pretty familiar to most people that 1 plus 1 equals 2, or even a million plus a million equals 2 million. And that's because anytime you add two positive numbers together, positive plus a positive, you will always get a positive number as a result. Sort of in a very similar way, if we add two negative numbers together, a negative plus a negative, you will always get a negative number as a result. Negative 5 plus negative 5 equals negative 10. Negative a million plus negative a million equals negative 2 million. Things get a little bit trickier, but not too much, if we're adding a positive and a negative number together. That result will depend on the size of the numbers, and we have to look at their absolute values to be able to determine whether the result, the sum of adding a positive to a negative or a negative to a positive, will be either on the right side of 0 or on the left. And we will look at that in a little more detail shortly. However, just a real quick number line view of how addition of integers works. Here I've got a simple problem, 2 plus 3. If I start at 2 on the number line and I move to the right, I go 1, 2, 3. I end up at 5. There we go. Right at 5. Should have put some more numbers on my number line here. What if I start at negative 1, which is right there to the left of 0, and add a negative 5? Well, remember, a negative plus a negative is going to equal, a negative plus a negative is right there. A negative plus a negative is going to equal another negative. So I'm at negative 1, and I go to negative 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. End up at negative 6. Okay? Well, let's look at some other ideas involving number lines and some other rules. Remember now that adding a positive number will always move to the right on a number line, no matter where I start. If I start over here and I add a positive, I'll be moving to the right. If I start over here and add a positive, I'll be moving to the right. That's the way it always works. Adding a negative always moves to the left, no matter where I start. Okay? If I start, say, at 5, and I add a negative number, that will move down in this direction, no matter where I start. Even if I start at a negative and add a negative, it moves in the left direction. Basic idea there. Okay? So if I start at, for example, using this problem right here, negative 3, okay, and I add 7, well, I'm adding a positive, so I move to the right that many times. 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and I end up at 4. Now, if I start at 4 and I add a negative, remember, adding a negative moves to the left. I start at 4, I move 5 to the left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I end up at negative 1. So you may have realized from looking this that this very important idea here is true, that adding a negative is the same thing as subtracting a positive. All right? Now, what about using absolute value? I mentioned that if the numbers had different signs on them. For example, I have in these two problems negative 44, the sign on that number is negative, and a positive 38. The sign on that one is positive. I'm adding a positive to a negative. Over here, I'm adding a negative to a positive. So let's look at this one first. I'm going to use absolute values to help us determine what the result is. First thing to do is find the absolute value of both numbers. And the absolute value of negative 44 is 44. The absolute value of 38 is 38. 44 is larger than 38, so this tells us that whatever sign was on 44, that will be the sign on this sum. We saw that the sign was negative, so no matter what happens here, I know that my answer is going to be negative. If I don't get a negative result, I need to check my work because it's going to be wrong. All right, so I'm at negative 44 somewhere on a number line. I add 38. I'm going to end up somewhere less than 0. And the way you do this is you subtract the one absolute value from the other. 44 minus 38. Make sure you line your ones column up. And make sure you line your tens column up. Got to keep your place values lined up when you're doing this. I'm going to have to borrow. However, to save a little bit of time, I can pretty easily figure out that 44 minus 38 is going to produce a result of 6. Okay? However, remember, the absolute value of negative 44 was our largest absolute value, so I have to use its sign. The answer is actually negative 6 to this problem right here. All right? Negative 6. Let's take a look at this one over here. How about 55 plus 20? We use the same idea. The absolute value of 55 equals 55. The absolute value of negative 20 is equal to 20. Here's our largest result right there. That number was positive, so my result of this operation is going to be positive. Again, I subtract the two absolute values. $35 is the result, and 55 plus negative 20 is equal to 55. Remember that I said adding a negative was the same thing as subtracting a positive? That's exactly what we ended up doing here to get the answer. Okay? All right. Now, one way to look at this using a number line, it's not real convenient to use a number line to add or subtract really large numbers, but there's something to be seen by this process. Let's take this problem right here. 100 plus negative 50. You may have already figured out that the answer is going to be 50. Okay. Now, if I look at the absolute value of 100, which is its distance from 0, is 100. The absolute value of negative 50 is, oops, sorry about that, 50. Goes right there. Okay. Now, what's the difference between those two? How much do I have to add to this to get up to there? Wow, it's 50. All right. Another way to look at that is I've got the absolute value of 100 there, and I take this negative 50's distance right here, and I move it over to here and lay it on the end. All this part kind of matches up and cancels out, and lo and behold, look what's left there. 50. Okay. All right, let's look at some more examples here. Negative 27 plus negative 13. I'm going to find their absolute values. And it was rather a waste of time. Wouldn't you agree? Why? Well, you probably notice they're both negative, so it doesn't matter which one is larger. It's going to have a negative sign in front of it. When they're both negative, you add them together, stick a negative sign. 40. And it's a little misleading to put that answer right there. Really, the answer is negative 27 plus negative 13 is equal to negative 40. Okay? Let's look at our next example. 45. Absolute value is 45. Negative 80 is 80. The one with the negative number has the largest absolute value. That tells me that the result is going to be negative. And as we did in our previous examples, I subtract their absolute values. Borrowing 35. How do we check our work? Well, I add 45 and 35 together, and I reproduce 80, my starting number that I subtracted from. That proves my result is correct. And my answer to 45 plus negative 80 is negative 35. one final one right here. I've got the absolute value of negative 16 is 16 plus a 51. The absolute value of 51 is, of course, 51. This is going to be the larger one. It's positive. Okay, so I know my result is going to be positive. I subtract their absolute values. 1 minus 16. Excuse me. That's 5 and 3. And this one's going to be a positive 35. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how it's done.